Welcome back to another creepy tale with the collective. If you've not subscribed to our channel, please do. Also click the thumbs up button and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything that we release. Tonight's tale is Hans, My Hedgehog by the Brothers Grimm. Long ago there was a farmer who had quite enough money and property to live upon, but rich as he was, he lacked one piece of fortune. He had no children. Many times when we went to market, the other farmers would laugh at him and question his lack of offspring. At last he flew into a rage, and he came home and exclaimed, "I will have a child, even if it should be a hedgehog." Soon after this speech, his wife gave birth to a child that was like a hedgehog above and a boy below, and when his wife saw it, she was frightened and said, "See, that you have cursed us." The farmer replied, "It cannot be helped now. We must have it christened, although it will have no godfather." And the wife said, "We can call it nothing else but Hans, my hedgehog." And when it was christened, and the priest said, "With its spikes it can't sleep in a common bed." So a pile of straw was laid beside the stove for Hans, my hedgehog, to lie upon. There he stayed for 8 years, until his father grew tired of him and wished he would die. But Hans, my hedgehog, did not die, and stayed in the same spot. And one day the farmer was on his way to a fair in a neighboring town. He asked his wife what he should bring home, and she told him, "A little piece of meat, some rolls of bread, some things for the housekeeping." Then he went to the maid, who wanted some slippers and a pair of stockings. Lastly, he asked Hans, my hedgehog, who replied, "Father, bring me some bagpipes." When the farmer returned home, he brought his wife the meat and bread, and his maid the slippers and stockings, and finally he went behind the oven and gave Hans, my hedgehog, the bagpipes. As soon as Hans, my hedgehog, had the pipes in hand, he said, "Father, go to the blacksmith and have him shoe the rooster. I will ride it away and never return." The father was glad to be rid of him, and had the rooster shod, and as soon as that was done, Hans, my hedgehog, sat upon it and rode away, taking with him pigs and donkeys, which he meant to tend in the forest. In the forest, Hans, my hedgehog, spurred the rooster to the top of the highest tree, and he sat there and tended the pigs and the donkeys for many years, until there were lots of pigs and donkeys, and all this time his father knew nothing of him. While Hans, my hedgehog, sat on the treetop, he played his bagpipes and made beautiful music. Once a king, who had lost his way in the forest, came riding past and chanced to hear him. He wondered at the sound and sent his servant to see where it came from. The servant looked about, but saw only a little animal upon a tree. It seemed to be a rooster, with a hedgehog on its back, and they made the music. The king told the servant to ask why it sat there and if it knew which road led to his kingdom. So Hans, my hedgehog, got down from the tree and said he would show him the way if, in return, the king would write a note that promised to give Hans, my hedgehog, whatever first came across the king when he arrived home. The king thought, "Well, I can easily do that for Hans, my hedgehog. He cannot read, and I can write what I like." So the king took pen and ink and wrote a note, and that done, Hans, my hedgehog, showed him the way, and he got safely home. But his daughter saw the king arriving from afar and was so overjoyed that she ran to meet and kiss him. The king remembered Hans, my hedgehog, and said that he had been forced to promise whatsoever first greeted him when he got home to a very strange animal that sat on a rooster, as if it were a horse, and made beautiful music. But then the king said he had written instead that he should not receive it, because Hans, my hedgehog, could not read anyway. The princess was pleased and said he had done well, for she never would have gone away with it. Hans, my hedgehog, however, looked after his donkeys and pigs, and was always happy and sat on the tree and played his bagpipes. It happened that another king came by with his servants, and he had lost his way as well, and did not know his way home because it was such a large forest. He also heard the beautiful music and sent his servant to find where it came from. The servant went to the tree, saw the rooster sitting at the top of it, and Hans my Hedgehog atop the rooster, and asked what he was doing there. "I am keeping my donkeys and my pigs, but how can I help you?" Hans my Hedgehog replied. The servant explained that they were lost and could not get back into their own kingdom, and asked if he would not show them the way. So Hans my Hedgehog got down from the tree and told the aged king that he would show him the way, if, in return, the king would write a note that promised to give Hans my Hedgehog whatever first came across the king when he arrived home. The king said, "Yes," and wrote a promise to Hans my Hedgehog that he should have this. That done, Hans my Hedgehog rode before him on the rooster and pointed out the way. And the king reached his kingdom safely. When he reached his palace, there was great rejoicing. The king had an only daughter who was very beautiful. She ran to meet him, threw her arms around his neck, and delighted to have her old father back again. She kissed him. She also asked where in the world he had been for so long. So the king told her how he had lost his way and had very nearly not come back at all. But as he was traveling through a great forest, a strange animal that sat on a rooster as if it were a horse, and made music, had shown him the way home. The king added that in return he had promised whatsoever first greeted him in the royal courtyard, and how that was she herself, and that made the king very sad. But she promised that, for love of her father, she would willingly go with this Hans my Hedgehog if he arrived to claim her. Hans my Hedgehog, however, took care of his pigs, and they became more pigs, and then more pigs, until there were so many that the whole forest was filled with pigs. And then Hans my Hedgehog sent word to his father to have every sty in the village emptied, for he was coming with such a great herd of pigs that anyone who could butcher should do so. His father was troubled at hearing this, for he thought Hans my Hedgehog had died long ago. Hans my Hedgehog, however, seated himself on the rooster and drove the pigs before him into the village, and ordered the slaughter to begin. Ho! Then there was butchering and hacking that could be heard 2 hours away. And when it was done, Hans my Hedgehog said, "Father, have the rooster shod once more at the forge, and I will ride away and never return." The father had the rooster shod once more, and was pleased that Hans my Hedgehog should never return again. Hans my Hedgehog rode away to the first kingdom, where the king had commanded that anyone who came riding on a rooster and carrying bagpipes should be shot at, stabbed, and butchered, so that he may not enter the castle. When, therefore, Hans my Hedgehog came riding, the king's guards attacked him with bayonets, but he spurred the rooster, and it flew up over the gates to the king's window, and lighted there. Hans my Hedgehog demanded that he be given what was promised, or he would take both the king's life and that of his daughter. Then the king begged his daughter to go away with Hans my Hedgehog in order to save both their lives. So the princess dressed herself in white, and her father gave her a carriage with 6 horses, magnificent attendants, great gold and treasures. She seated herself in the carriage and placed Hans my Hedgehog beside her with the rooster and the bagpipes, and when they drove away, the king thought he would never see his daughter again. But things would turn out differently than he thought, for when they were a short distance from the castle, Hans my Hedgehog tore her pretty clothes off and pierced her with the hedgehog's spikes until she was bloodied. "That is the reward of your falseness," he said. "Go your way. I will not have you." And he chased her home again, where she lived in disgrace for the rest of her days. Hans my Hedgehog, however, rode further on the rooster, carrying his bagpipes to the land of the second king, to whom he had also shown the way. This king had proclaimed that if anyone like Hans my Hedgehog should come, his guards were to present arms, salute him, and give him safe conduct. When the king's daughter saw Hans my Hedgehog, she was horrified, for he really looked very strange. But she could do nothing, for she had given her promise to her father. So Hans my Hedgehog was welcomed by her and seated at the royal table with the princess by his side. When the evening came, it was time to go to bed. She was afraid of his spikes, but he told her not to fear, for no harm would come to her. Hans my Hedgehog asked the old king to place 4 guards by the door of the chamber and have them light a great fire. When Hans my Hedgehog was about to get into bed, he would creep out of his hedgehog skin and leave it lying at the bedside, and the men were to run quickly to it, throw it in the fire, and stay by it until it was consumed. When the clock struck 11, Hans entered the chamber, stripped off the hedgehog's skin, and left it lying at the bedside. Then came the guards, who fetched it swiftly and threw it in the fire. When the fire had consumed his hedgehog skin, Hans was saved. He lay on the bed and had the shape of a man, but his skin was charred as if he had been burned. The king sent for his physician, who bathed him with ointments and balm so that his skin returned to normal, and he was a handsome young gentleman. When the king's daughter saw that, she was glad, and the next morning they woke up joyfully and were married. Hans received the kingdom from his wife's aged father. When several years had passed, Hans brought his wife to visit his father, introducing himself as his son. The father declared that he had never had but one, who had been born like a hedgehog with spikes. Then Hans made himself known, and the father rejoiced, and returned with his son to his kingdom.